When we hear the story of David and Goliath, we tend to focus on one man's bravery in facing down another man's physical might. However, if we look closer, we can find a deeper meaning that has stood the test of time. A story about fear versus faith, where ultimately faith triumphs over brute force. And it was one secret about Goliath that ended up being his fatal flaw. In today's episode, we will look at the untold story of David versus Goliath and see how a simple lie about Goliath's greatness was what caused his downfall. When the Israelites were in conflict with the Philistines, two mighty warriors from opposing sides would face off against each other. Goliath of Gath and David of Bethlehem. While the Bible tells us the tale of their legendary battle, there are hidden details that suggest something else was going on here. Goliath was not only a giant of immense physical strength, but also suffered from a horrible medical condition that caused him pain and discomfort. This makes us wonder if David knew about Goliath's condition and used it to his advantage, or if he went into the fight blind. At first glance, the story of David and Goliath seems like a classic David versus Goliath tale. A young shepherd boy takes on a giant warrior with nothing but a sling and some stones. But as we read further, we find clues that suggest Goliath's size was not just physical, but psychological as well.
He was cursed by God. Let us imagine for a moment that you are part of the Israelites' army facing off against the Philistines.
For 40 days, Goliath taunts and jeers at the Israelites, challenging them to send out a warrior to fight him. Each day he repeats the same taunts, getting more and more irritated as no one takes up his challenge. As the days go by, you start to feel hopeless and afraid. The thought of facing such a giant, not to mention his possible curse, fills you with dread. On the 40th day, when David arrives on the scene, he hears Goliath's taunts and feels the same fear and hopelessness that have been gripping the Israelite army. But then something unexpected happens. Instead of backing down from the challenge, David steps forward and accepts. Now let's consider David's perspective. He has heard Goliath's taunts and seen the fear they have instilled in his fellow Israelites. He knows that something needs to be done, but why does he choose to do it his way? One possibility is that David saw an opportunity to break through Goliath's psychological defenses. Maybe he realized that the giant wasn't just physically strong, but also had a weak point, a secret that could be exploited. We know that Goliath was a giant, but what if he was also vulnerable? What if his size and strength came at a cost? Imagine the toll that carrying around such great mass would take on his body. Perhaps he was slow, clumsy, or suffered from chronic pain. If David could uncover this secret and use it against Goliath, he might have a chance of winning the battle, not by fighting head-on, but by exploiting his opponent's weaknesses. This idea is supported by the Bible verse that says, "And David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword, with a spear and with a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, whom you have challenged.'" In this passage, David doesn't boast about his physical strength or skill. Rather, he emphasizes his connection to God and the divine power he believes in. This suggests that David is relying on more than just brute force and is looking for a way to defeat Goliath that doesn't involve physical confrontation. After all, why did David ask for Goliath's armor after defeating him? He probably wanted to study his armor and weapon to discover the reason behind his adversary's invincibility. And it was then that he discovered the one weakness that proved to be fatal for Goliath. Before facing Goliath, David sought guidance from King Saul, who offered him his armor and weapons. However, David couldn't wear them because they didn't fit. This moment is significant for a few reasons. First, it shows that even though Goliath was a giant, there were limits to what he could endure. No human can carry an infinite amount of weight, so there must have been some physical constraints on Goliath. Second, it reveals that Goliath's armor and weapons were designed for a much larger opponent than Saul. Finally, it underscores that despite his size, Goliath was still vulnerable to certain things. David may have realized that Goliath's biggest power was also his biggest weakness. He noticed that the armor and weapons designed for Goliath wouldn't even fit on someone like Saul, suggesting that Goliath's size and strength could be his downfall. By trying to use the same armor and weapons, David may have gained insight into the physical limitations of his opponent and devised a plan to exploit them. The real story of David and Goliath is much more complex and nuanced than the traditional narrative suggests. David's victory over Goliath was not just a triumph of physical strength, but a strategic move that took advantage of Goliath's secrets and vulnerabilities. The fact that Goliath taunted the Israelites for 40 days before facing David suggests that he was not only physically powerful, but also mentally unstable. His boasting and taunting reveal a desperate need for attention and validation, possibly stemming from low self-esteem or insecurity. David, on the other hand, remained calm and focused throughout the ordeal, relying on his faith and quick thinking to outmaneuver his opponent. Despite Goliath's intimidating size and strength, David managed to defeat him without suffering any physical harm. This feat is even more impressive considering that Goliath was armed with a spear and a sword, while David only had a sling and a few stones. Ultimately, David's victory over Goliath was not just a physical triumph, but a testament to the power of the human spirit over brute force. His story teaches us that with courage, determination, and a little bit of cunning, we can overcome any obstacle that stands in our way. So the next time you hear the story of David and Goliath, remember that it's not just a fairy tale, but a profound lesson in the power of the human spirit. Now let's discuss another secret about Goliath that made him lose against David. Goliath was not only physically imposing, but also suffered from a horrible medical condition that plagued him throughout his life. According to historical records, Goliath's condition was so severe that it forced him to leave the battlefield several times. This must have been incredibly frustrating for him as a warrior, always having to retreat at the last minute due to his illness. As David approached, Goliath noticed him and immediately began his usual taunts. He called David a little dog and a little cur, basically saying that David isn't worth his time. He told David to turn back before he got hurt, essentially warning him to back down before it was too late. This continued for 40 days straight, with Goliath repeating the same threats and insults every single day. It drove the Israelites crazy. However, nobody understood why Goliath was doing this. They had never heard of his medical condition and assumed that he was just trying to scare them away. But the truth was that Goliath was terrified of facing David in battle. He knew that if he lost, his reputation as a great warrior would be ruined forever. And with each passing day, his medical condition worsened, making him weaker and more afraid. Eventually, his torment became unbearable and he collapsed on the battlefield, unable to continue the fight. At that moment, David realized that he had defeated Goliath without even throwing a stone. He approached the giant cautiously, not knowing what to expect. But instead of finding a fierce fighter, he discovered a man in great pain. Goliath begged David to end his suffering quickly, which surprised David. He had expected Goliath to fight to the death, but here he was begging for mercy. Touched by Goliath's plea, David decided to honor his request and put him out of his misery. He pulled his sword and ended Goliath's life swiftly and painlessly. In doing so, David not only avenged his people, but also freed Goliath from his torment. It's a lesser-known detail in the story of David and Goliath, but it adds a new layer of complexity to their relationship. Initially, David sees Goliath as nothing more than a bully, someone who uses his size and strength to intimidate and harm others. He challenges Goliath to a fight, not because he wants to be cruel, but because he wants to protect his people and restore order. However, as the story unfolds, David begins to see Goliath as more than just a monster. He discovers that Goliath is a flawed human being who is struggling to overcome his own internal demons. This realization causes David to approach the fight with more empathy and understanding, ultimately leading to a more meaningful victory. In conclusion, David's confrontation with Goliath was not just a battle between good and evil, but a journey of self-discovery and personal growth. Through his interactions with the giant, David learned the importance of compassion, understanding, and the true meaning of strength. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. We look forward to bringing you more exciting stories from history. Thanks for watching.